Alexander of Macedon by Harold Lamb. We are in chapter 20, Corrosion of Wealth, which is in part 6. On their part, the following day, Egyptian dealers urged him to grant them a tariff to protect the price of grain. In Memphis, they argued that the markets of Egypt had been secluded before his coming, but now, owing to the increased traffic through Alexandria, foreign grain was being imported by Athenian and Carthaginian convoys. Carthaginian. It seemed to the man now, settled on the throne of Darius, that in spite of his effort to eliminate old frontiers, new blocks and centers were forming, struggling to protect their wealth. Within these growing mercantile centers, individuals were scheming to secure their own gain. It seemed as if a human tide was settling in. From Europe and the West, a flood of traders, adventurers, barbers, impoverished farmers, ex-soldiers, moving towards the new settlements in the East. By penetrating Bactria and Sogd and India, he had linked up the continental caravan routes with the coastal terminals. In consequence, Sidona was loaded with luxury goods. Caravan junctions like Petra, built upon redstone cliffs, levied new tolls to tap this current of wealth. They told him that the Nabateans had enlarged Petra, but could not remember who the Nabateans were. Arabs, perhaps. Nabatean is one of the branches that helped develop the Arabic language. And now the word Arab is not just the nomads out in the desert, it's basically the whole race. How they're referring to it. The highest priest of a city called Jerusalem sent to request his protection, saying that Kurush, the great king before him, had granted that protection. And we can say that race, them and the Persian, if you say Arab and Persian, they could be said to be the fastest growing race because they're the mixed races between the continents, and Arab has reached clear to the other side of Africa, and clear to the other side of Asia, you get what you would call Persian in terms of, if you divide it, yeah, there's the Kurds and stuff, but you know what I mean, that region, well, the Kurds were conquered by the Persians, so that's why these titles are fitting. Protection, Alexandros cried. If there is peace, have you not protection, all of you? Has there been a war or even a raid in 7 years? You are protected. Ionian slave dealers, who imported children from Delos and Lesbos, complained that the new minting of gold staters had reduced the value of the Athenian silver owls in which they had taken payment for such slaves. Of course, Alexandros himself had fixed an exchange rate, but people, common folk, preferred gold to silver. Women, too, liked to bank money and have ornaments at the same time. By stringing the fine new gold coins into necklaces instead of the silver ankle bangles of the old days, so the slave traders had lost money by accepting silver. Alexandros had to force himself to sit in audience most of the day and go over petitions and accounts at night. The papers arrived in a babel of scripts, and even some odd stamped clay tablets. He had to work now with a staff of interpreters. Greek, he came to understand, could be no more than the language of political intercourse. Otherwise, these people met to keep their own speech. India has 22 official languages, although they have over 60. For example, their petitions came to him in Aramea, Arabic, and Hittite. Aramea, there really wasn't a separation between Hebrew and Aramaic. and they didn't call it Hebrew at that time. He wondered if they were actually mingling their trade and their schooling, or were growing together in the throes of this meeting of East and West. Were they sharing ideas or fusing their ambitions? He thought of moving masses of Asiatics into the Mediterranean and to quicken this process of cohesion to balance the heavy immigration from the West. In one record of payments, Alexandros noted that a daily charge for 1 sheep and flour and wine to be supplied to the Magi, who kept watch at the tomb of Corrosion, had been stopped during his absence. Why, he asked the secretaries. The secretaries did not know. Hurriedly they sent for food accountants, who in turn found a courier who explained that the Magi in question were no longer given food because they were not at their post in the watch house by the tomb. Why, the courier thought they were in prison now and fed on prison fare. Well, what men are at the tomb? Lord, there's no one, so the sheep. I'm not thinking about the sheep. Why were the guards taken from the tomb? The courier did not know. When Alexandros burst out at him in a rage, a revenue officer explained fearfully the tomb of the first Persian king had been broken into and robbed of everything except a few strings of beads and purple and hyacinth-colored cloaks of no great value. So, after the tomb had been robbed, the Magi had been imprisoned. And remember that the Masla Yasnahe Zarathustrahe faith does not allow either recreational nor ritual intoxicants. But we know that the Achaemenian Zoroastrianism brought back ritual drug use and recreational drug use for the elite. So, holding in his anger, Alexandros left them and took a horse from the stables. He noticed it was a white charger of the Nisa'an herd. Most of that famous horse herd had discovered to be missing on his return. Riding alone, although a troop of the mounted Agema followed at a discreet distance, he climbed the hill road, Pasar Gada, dismounting at daybreak by the stream where the great limestone sarcophagus of Corrosion stood. Exposed to the weather, climbing the pedestal steps, he saw that the aperture at one end had been broken through and was now blocked by an empty keg. The coffin of hammered gold and the gifts laid on it had vanished. With what was left of the body of Corrosion, running his hand along the side slab, Alexandros felt under his fingers the lettering that he knew by heart. O man who passes by, I am Corrosion, who founded the empire of the Persians and formed the kingdom of Asia. So do not begrudge me this resting place. The thieves had begrudged Corrosion his tomb because of the gold in it. Alexandros did not think that the Magi had broken into the tomb, who they guarded for centuries. A Macedonian had done it. Without a cloak, he sat on a marble step, pondering, watching the hard gleam of the sun come over the bare hills, striking through the branches of the trees. He remembered that the trees had no leaves because it was winter. Then he was aware of the old men. They stood waiting just beneath him, wrapped in white garments, bound with sashes the color of blood. They seemed to be awaiting permission to speak, and Alexandros, recognizing them as Magi, different from the watchers of the tomb, said to them, speak. And, eventually they'll become to be called Majus. Then these 3 Magi spoke what was in their minds. O man, now that you are here, it is clear that you are and must be the successor to him who is gone. From the Neacan ancestors, the succession descends from king to king, but at times it descends upon no one, for it is the Vareno, which is a glory, and it cannot descend upon one unworthy. It cannot be seized by force. When it comes, it cannot be hid. Many kings the glory has passed by, and their names will be forgotten. From Kurush it has come to you, but never acts whence the glory cometh. Alexandros sat there, looking down into the aged, lined faces that made no salutation to him, and when they had spoken, they mentioned to him to come down from his step. When he did so, they sat around him on the cold ground and held out their hands. Their hands held figs wrapped in leaves, terebinth covered with linen, and sour milk in a silver cup. This food, the Magi said, was for him to break his fast. They shared it with him when they sat down by them. At the end of the unusual breakfast, they brought him water from the stream to bathe his hands. It was very cold. He was chosen the people's king, they said then, can choose little for himself thereafter. This time they bent their heads to him before going away, walking across the shafts of sunlight, not looking at the armed men of the Agema, who eyed them curiously. The soldiers thought it was a poor breakfast for the beggars. It was a poor breakfast the beggars had brought to the king. Alexandros had eaten because the old men wanted him to. He wondered if they had been watching over the empty tomb, and he felt bewildered because he could not remember what language they had used. It had all seemed familiar, perhaps because he had watched himself at the sarcophagus of Kurush years before. Cyrus the Great is what we call him. Perhaps because he felt weak and confused, like this, when he drifted, wounded down the Indus, or was it when he strained to climb over the snowfields to the height of Indra, or searched for the sea and the passage of the desert? Then he had been trying to find something that escaped him, and he wondered if he had found it here. He did not know, and his brain was too wearied to think about it. He wanted to sleep. It was the hour when he usually drank himself into stupor, but he had no wine at the tomb. Probably a good thing, right? When he felt drowsy, he stretched out on the steps, edging himself to the sunny side, and slept with his arm over his eyes. He remembered the coming of the Magi, and thought of it again when Calenus approached him, grumbling soon after. "Yavanna," said the ascetic, "you have troubled much of the earth, but you own no more of it than that which will cover your body, and you die." This was Calenus's way of saying farewell, because he announced that he was not well, and, being far removed from his land, he had no wish to go on living. He wanted to be burned. At first, Alexandros did not believe him, but the ascetic was determined to lie upon the funeral pyre and burn. In the end, Alexandros gave orders to carry out his wish, and presented him with the fine horse and gold vessels for sacrifice with him. Of these, however, Calenus did not approve. He gave away the horse and gold objects to the Macedonians who crowded to see him burned. To their amazement, the fragile men lie motionless on the piled wood when the fire spread around him. Alexandros, watching, ordered the trumpets to sound and the elephants to give their roaring salute, because he thought that the Indian must be a very brave man. The army felt as if it had lost a talisman, and wished that Calenus had not decided to burn himself. The near chaos in the east had spread to the west. Hearing of Alexandros's return and the punishment of the other officials, Harpalus, the semi-invalid, whom Alexandros had entrusted with the public treasure, fled from Babylon and Sardis. It appeared that he had built up a fortune for himself. With it bought a following of mercenaries. So with gold and a miniature army he sailed to Greece. Landing at the port of Athens, Harpalus who had ascended for a second time, argued for a patriotic rebellion, overthrow of the Macedonian yoke by Athens, and a restoration of Athenian glory. The more hot-headed politicians fell in with him, and he brought others, but he could neither buy nor persuade Demosthenes, whom he needed most to inspire a rebellion. Demosthenes instead spoke against Harpalus. War with Alexandros would be madness. It could only be the ruin of Athens. Escaping from the city, Alexandros' revenue collector sought greater safety elsewhere, but Demosthenes was accused of taking gold from him. When the funds Harpalus had abandoned in the Parthenon proved to be only half the amount expected, and Demosthenes was condemned by the war party for balking their plans, and by the Macedonian party for taking the stolen gold. It was typical of the volatile Athenians that they should charge the one man of integrity among them of accepting a bribe. Had Demosthenes at long last changed his opinion of Alexandros? Had Alexandros ceased to dread the power of Demosthenes' oratory? Certainly, the two who had been antagonists at Chaeronea shared the hope of peace under the Macedonian Commonwealth. The disturbance in Greece, the wrangle over Harpalus and his stolen treasure, and the quarreling of factions in Macedon caused Alexandros to send Carterus, his ablest administrator, to replace Antipater. That aged general had carried out orders faithfully, but rather naturally he looked on the Greeks as rebels against military authority, and Alexandros felt the need of a younger man who could give orders at home, especially as his mother, Olympias, was forming a faction of her own. Besides, Carterus was weakened by fever, and Alexandros feared for the life of his most brilliant lieutenant. After Antipater's removal of his son, Cassander made the journey out to the east to protest to Alexandros. Those who accuse my father have framed charges against him from a great distance. He phrased this carefully, making no mention of Alexandros. Instead, the king caught the note of caution. This sounds like one of Aristotle's sophisms, he sneered. If you and your father are guilty, you will be punished. I do not know yet if you are guilty. The violence of this sunburned, emaciated man who moved painfully when he walked, who remained silent unless words poured out of him, affected Cassander strongly. He felt that this new Alexandros no longer trusted his friends or placed hope in the entities to which he had sacrificed formerly. Cassander had not seen Alexandros or the surviving veterans for 10 years, and he was not prepared for the change in them. Men said that he became so terrified that after Alexandros' death he could not pass a statue of the king without trembling. Before then, Alexandros had left the sanctuary of Persepolis to journey over the ranges to Susa, where he could maintain closer contact with the West. The impact of his return was felt from the Danube to the Nile, and the incredible story of the Macedonian conquest was told in Memphis and Athens and Pella. Greek scholars found it difficult to grasp the entirety of such accomplishments. They heard the tale of 70 cities founded, of caravan trade arriving from 20,000 stadia, of the navigation of the Southern Sea. This enlarged world perspective fascinated and disturbed them. It revealed resources that dwarfed the means of the Greek cities and populations that reduced the Greeks to a minority at the western edge of the oikumena. I don't know the Greek spelling. Whenever Alexandros moved now, the government moved with him. He was drawn by the need of administration towards the center of his dominion, as Kalonnas had once suggested. But what his government was to be remained uncertain. Contemporary records give no account of Alexandros' plan for the future. Some observers, like Ptolemy, seemed to think that Alexandros had no plan. Certainly he announced none, as Aristotle had rejected the ideal city of Plato's Republic. Alexandros appeared to have rejected Aristotle's reasoned concept of an educated oligarchy. For one thing, his dominion was so vast that no one city or privileged group could have controlled it. Well, we do have a lot of high education among the oligarchy, although some of the people who aren't so licensed are very, very advanced in their learning and education. But we look at the leaders in my country, the people that are set up as figureheads. There's people like that with a lot better ideas of ruling, more worked out ideas of ruling, that you can wander the streets and find some people that sound like they'd be better people for leaders, but for one thing, his dominion was so vast that no one city or privileged group could have controlled it. Just like gun control laws, we need people got to address the reward system, making guns illegal or making that everybody has to buy non-metal guns. It's not quite going to fix the problem. Although Rushanak was pregnant now, Alexandros made no public arrangement for a son who might succeed him. In fact, he seemed to waste no thought on it at all, on his close kinsmen in Macedon, or how they might act toward the child of an Asiatic woman. It is said at this point that he was trying to restore the bounds of the Iranian Empire, and undoubtedly he is greatly influenced by the rule of Corrosion and the peace that came out of it. But he said himself that the Macedonians had gone beyond the Persian rule. He hardly looked upon himself as a benevolent monarch, because he seemed to have the sense of a mission to be fulfilled. To the army he spoke of the new Imperium as the Macedonian Commonwealth. The list of his title that Ptolemy still kept out of curiosity had grown in strange fashion. Alexandros, third of that name, king of the Macedonians, semi-divine, limited monarch of the Greek cities, wholly divine pharaoh of Egypt, ally and master of the Ionian ports, full master of the Phoenician cities and fleets, protector of the high priest of Judea, overlord of the Magians of Persia, friend of the Rajas in the Punjab, and something unknown in the rest of India. It was clear to Ptolemy that Alexandros cared nothing for the titles as such, but Ptolemy was convinced that as long as Alexandros lived, he could maintain control over his embryo world state. Now, he's kind of the example that Alexandros Magas is the example of, if we look at these heroes of mythology not as gods, who knows, we can accomplish something. Or perhaps somebody that's thinking this can accomplish greatness that would be thought impossible, and keep going for further greatness. The Greeks seem to have reached the same conclusion when the Delphic oracle proclaimed that Alexandros had departed from among men and had become divine even while living, so that sacrifices should be made to his image and games held in his armor. But Ptolemy was not surprised, nor did Alexandros seem either pleased or displeased. Probably the meticulous Greeks had taken this means of legalizing to their satisfaction Alexandros's peculiar overlordship. It was no disgrace to give obedience or honor to a divine being, whatever plan he had in mind. And Alexandros did not discuss the situation as he had done in earlier years with the military council. The Lord of Eurasia seemed to have been moved by a definite purpose at Susa, where he might have rested, he faced his problems without respite. He demanded effort as unceasing from his subordinates. The problem of famine and water throughout the lands of Asia dependent for crops on rainfall worried him. And he had work started on a canal system stemming out from the rivers. His practice of pushing out settlements had borne fruit amazingly. Never had the ancient world seen so many cities arise in so short a time, nor did the latter centuries repeat this phenomenon until settlements spread through the inland America after 2 millenniums. Walls of sun-baked clay brick were raised in a few days, and open-air theaters and athletic fields could be scraped out of hillsides or laid out on the desert plain. For these community centers were modern in plan, with education and entertainment provided those who thronged into them. Mixed populations filled most of them as traders sought the new entrepots of supply, and the folk of the countryside drifted into the source of money and goods. An older caravan city, like Palmyra, was peopled with Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, and Syrians. When the first Romans ventured out to it, both Palmyra and Petra levied taxes on the caravan trade that transshipped at their junctions. This rapid growth of trade took care of the growth of the new cities. Many of the new settlements did not prosper in this way, and remnants of ex-soldiers and natives subsisted there as best as they could. They became, in fact, exiles. For some reason, Alexandros recalled all bands of Greek mercenaries from the eastern post and startled them on the journey home. At the same time, he discovered at Ecbatana full 3,000 Greek actors, musicians, and artisans awaiting transport east. It seemed clear that he begun to break up the military nuclei and encourage civilian settlers. Whether the soldiers proved troublesome or whether he felt the need for them had passed, it is not known. At Susa, he operated on the army itself. He had by no means forgotten the mutiny at Beas. The test of willpower between him and the Macedonian veterans, who now formed only a small portion of the field army, was still undecided. Now he needed settlers who could form a reserve of fighting men, more than a large field army. Moreover, he could no longer keep Macedonian swords suspended over the heads of the Asiatic nations. At least, he had no intention of doing so. By now, some 30,000 Asiatic recruits had been fully trained in European drill, and Alexandros began to sift them into the Macedonian commands, so that there was often only one Macedonian company to a regiment, and he disbanded the old phalanx, which had lost its spirit after the Jalam. The old phalanx, which had lost its this hedgehog-like formation, was useless in any case, and a unit in the immense plains. Quietly he raised Iranian and Bactrian and Scythian officers to high ranks, even among the companions. It was necessary, and he knew it, to have a Eurasian army in his new state, and not the troublesome Macedonian expeditionary force with which he had started. The veterans, however, did not see it that way. Alexandros called the new recruits the epigoni, the afterborn. Borrowing the word from an old Greek legend, the veterans called them the afterbirth. Keenly aware of the situation, they felt that Alexandros was working to free himself from the need of their services.